All right, I'm back, and I think I might have lied to you guys. I was just looking at how many pages are left. It's maybe this video and one more, because I don't want to make any more of those super long videos. They take way too long to load. So anyway, let's get going. We'll see how far we get. Remember, Scrooge had just ridden with the ghost to see the coal miners celebrating. Then they went out to sea and saw the people in the lighthouse. So it's been strangers in the lighthouse celebrating. So now let's see where they go from here. I think this is a part that's going to be of interest to us because we're going to reintroduce some characters from the very beginning. So that it'll be an important part of the. So I'm on page 52. And just down at the second paragraph there, if you're following along. Again, the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, on and on, until being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel. They look in the bow. The officers who had the watch, dark, ghostly figures in their several stations. But every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for another on that day than on any day of the year. Then they had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered that those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find him in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. So suddenly they go from flying over the sea, now they're at his nephew's house. So remember his nephew from the beginning, Merry Christmas, Uncle, bah humbug. Ha ha, laughed Scrooge's nephew. Ha ha ha. If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things that while there is infection and disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in his way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily. Ha 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 ha! He said that Christmas was a humbug as I live, cried Scrooge's nephew. He believed it, too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless those women, they never do anything by halves. They're always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking, capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, and no doubt it was all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory, too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. He's a comical old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. I'm sure he's very rich, Fred, hinted Scrooge's niece. At least you always tell me so. What of that, my dear, said Scrooge's nephew. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking. He's never going to benefit us with it. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner. and with the dessert upon the table, were clustered round the fire by lamplight. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right expressed an opinion on the subject, whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. So this conversation that Scrooge now is overhearing, his nephew, this happy-go-lucky guy, is actually amused by Scrooge and feels bad for him. And his whole argument to his wife is, who's he hurting but himself? He decides he hates us? Pfft. And then he makes a joke, says, it's not even like he's missing a good meal. And she's like, I think he's missing a great meal. So that's just a side thing so we get insight into the family. But really, the whole thing is Scrooge is overhearing this nephew who he thinks of as poor and kind of silly, actually feeling bad for him. "Do go on, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. "He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow." Scrooge's nephew revealed in another laugh that it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar. His example was unanimously followed. "I was only going to say," said Scrooge's nephew, "that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean, to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him if he finds me going in there in good temper year after year and saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you?' If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday." It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of shaking Scrooge. But being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about. When they sung a glee or a catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing, you might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more. So this is some good direct characterization of Scrooge, and thought that if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life, of his own happiness, with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas. Forfeits are like games, like just like family games. When its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop. There was first a game of blind man's bluff. Of course there was. And I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas Present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself against the curtains. Wherever she went, there he went. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, on purpose, he would have made a feint endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would have instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But then at last he caught her, when, in spite of all her sulking wrestlings and her rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape. Then his conduct was the most execrable. For his pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was not necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and a certain chain about her neck, was vile and monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it, when, another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man bluff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool, in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. but she joined in the forfeits and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with the guess quite loud, and often guessed quite right too. For the sharpest needle, best Whitechapel warranted not to cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But this spirit could not be done. "Here is a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out, he only answering to the question yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal. An animal growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a manger, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, the nephew burst into fresh roar of laughter, and was inexpressibly tickled, that he was obliged to get up on the sofa and stamp. At last, the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I have found out! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative and sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendencies that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I'm sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge!" "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried, "a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, wherever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had become imperceptibly so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return and thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had not given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. That's the bottom of page 56. We'll stop there. We'll finish 56 and finish the stave in the next video. But I wanted to get in all of the nephew. That's important because they also toasted Scrooge. So he's seen a lot of positive things, even in people he didn't treat well. So I will see you next time, and we'll finish it off, and then I'll see you tomorrow.